Our public schools are perhaps the most democratic of our institutions. Due to the election of school trustees, governance of public education is shared closely between professional educators, government bureaucrats, and the communities themselves. Among the stakeholder groups who weigh in during deliberations on school policies are parents, sometimes as individuals, other times in organizations. Parents as voters have undeniable influence. Among parent activists in BC, few exceed the notoriety and influence of Dawn Steele. Ms. Steele's activism began with advocacy for her child who has special educational needs. She has also come to affect the debate on a number of other school issues, including government funding, school closings, accountability, and childhood poverty. Informed activist parents represent a stakeholder group with special credibility in the education policy landscape. Dawn Steele is one of BC's most prominent parent voices, and we welcome her to Your Education Matters. Dawn, you have a background as a professional writer and formerly as a journalist, so you have quite a background in gathering information and knowing how to source information to the most powerful effect. So for the benefit of our audience, I wonder if you'd talk with us about how to get the best information on BC education.
Thank you, Paul. The first place I go for information is my son's school. And I talk to the staff there, particularly if I want information about his experience in education. I also talk a lot to other parents. I have several provincial networks, and I get enormous feedback, which is enormously useful from other parents about their experiences, what works, what doesn't, what's good, what's not so good. School board, public processes are really useful places for getting information. I actively participate in the annual budget meetings at the Vancouver School Board, for example, and listening to the other groups, stakeholder groups, parent groups, delivering their briefs is hugely informative on sort of broadening your perspective outside of your specific interests. The ministry has amazing information on their website. If you're a researcher like me who loves to go and dig up stuff, policy reports, databases, how-to guides, lots of great stuff there. Nationally, StatsCan has an annual education report that's really useful because it puts the BC picture in a neutral perspective against what's happening in other provinces. Media. Local papers are a great source of information in Vancouver. We have local papers like the Courier, which has a great education reporter, but little papers all around the province are doing a great job covering local education issues. And one of the things I've been doing is I've been trying to gather all that data from all those little local newspapers and local reports, and I created a provincial website called the BC Education Coalition, which is collating that information and separating it by district. So you can go and look for your district and see what's been happening over the last month. This is all focused on the education cuts, the whole debate going on there. We also have special pages on special education, rural schools, the arts, things like that.
You are providing a service of collating some of this together in, again, give me the name of the website.
It's the BC Education Coalition. It's http://stopeducationcuts.org. And you know, the web has been an incredible resource for parents, for empowering us, I think, through electronic social networks, email, Facebook, Google groups. It's been a great way of empowering parents to get informed and stay in touch with each other. Does
this take place of blogging for you, having this website, or do you also blog?
I try to focus on that website of just gathering information from other sources and putting it all in one place. I actively engage in a lot of debate, for example, on other blogs like Janet Steffenhagen's report card blog, which also provides lots of coverage of education issues.
Right. Are there any other blogs that people can look to, or is there a way to search for blogs on BC education?
There are not that many, actually, other than I think a lot of the activity happens on the debate. Which is what the blogging part is about, happens on Janet Steffenhagen's blog, and it's often very heated debate, not always that useful or focused. But
now you're talking about the comments.
Yeah.
Yes, that's where the debate really happens.
Yeah.
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 Yes, I've noticed that. Well, BCTF runs quite a website, and that leads me to the question of the stakeholder groups. How do you weigh their information? How objective do you think it is? How valuable for a person trying to get straight information?
I think, you know, all of the stakeholder groups, and as a parent, I consider we're one of the stakeholder groups. We all have our strengths, and we all have our blind spots. So I think it depends on the question you're asking. And for example, if you want to know about teaching, talk to teachers. They're the ones who know about teaching. If you want to know about how schools are managed, administrators and superintendents are the ones managing the schools. That's where their expertise is. If you want to ask about finances, talk to our accountants. The secretary treasurers, for example, are the ones who manage the finances. Or parents and students can tell you about outcomes. And then I think there are also complex questions that may need to go beyond that to people with expertise who are independent.
Well, the allegation's often made, however, that these are self-interested parties, so they're in a sense cooking the books. How does a citizen reader sort that out? You go to the stakeholder website, there's undoubtedly some excellent information there, but there's also their point of view embedded in it, I suppose, or in what issues they choose not to deal with. How do you read beyond the lines?
I think where it's really important is when you get really complex, tough questions, such as some of the questions that have come up in the BC education debate. Is funding sufficient? The accountability debate, and you know, how do you measure, how do you provide accountability? Those sorts of questions. And when you get into, you're talking about, the debate is mostly about really technical issues, and I think that's where people like you, people who study the science of education, who are more the experts, can really provide useful additional perspective to help us put these varying points of view in perspective.
Yes, well, it isn't easy because even for someone like myself who spent a whole lifetime in a career as a scholar, researcher, administrator, questions are so complex and also so bound to their locales that answering it for one place doesn't necessarily answer it for another.
Yeah.
And some amazingly simple questions we've never come up with answers to. How long should a school day be? How long should a period be? How many students should be in a class? How big should a school be? I mean, things that you would think would be 101, they're not resolved.
Yeah.
And need to be decided contextually, I guess. And that leads us, I suppose, to the question of planning, because even though we might have information, then it comes to a point where we need to look forward and decide how we're going to use that information. So what are some of your conclusions about strategic planning in BC education?
I think that's probably one of the most important points that was addressed in the recent Special Advisors report on the situation in Vancouver, is the need to be more strategic in planning. I think certainly since my child started school in 1998, what we've seen is a succession of annual education fads, where each year we have something different. You know, school business companies, choice, model schools, full-day kindergarten. We're sort of jumping around with these little fad things as opposed to sort of answering the big questions. And I think we do need to start asking those big questions. What public interest are we expecting the public education system to serve? How do we do that? What does it cost? How do we track performance based on those expectations and measure outcomes effectively? But I think you have to go back and ask those big questions, and that's not something that one individual is going to determine. It's going to be, you're going to need to get all the voices in to help shape that. And the public, not just the direct stakeholders in education, but what public interest are we trying to serve?
So are you saying that the mission is unclear right now for provincial public education?
Absolutely, and I think that's where a lot of the debate stems, is that different people have different expectations of what a public education system should deliver, and they're evaluating the system based on their own expectations. So if we all have different expectations, we're going to have very different ideas about how well the system is performing.
Should the planning be provincial, or should it be district by district?
I think we need a provincial plan. I think actually we need a national plan, and it feeds down through that we determine as Canadians what our public education system is about, and then how that works out provincially, and then it goes down. How does that work out by district and by school?
What would be some of your first priorities if they were a planning process and you went forward to testify?
My priority would be we have different kids with different needs who all need to get educated, is to how do we design a school system that is catering to the diversity of the kids who are in our school system today. I think we need to look more broadly than pure academics. What can a public education and does a public education provide to society besides just teaching kids how to read and write? So I would like to see both of those questions really top of the list and get a societal consensus on how do we address them.
So you're for a broad, I would say, progressive mission for the schools, dealing with much more than the 3 R's.
Yeah, I think looking at my son, for example, what he will take from his education, what will serve him in life will be far more than the math he's learned or the English he's learned. And
parents seem to know that, but somehow, as policy emerges, it has tended to narrow the curriculum in recent years.
Yeah, and that's the challenge, as funding challenges, resourcing, you know, the complexity of the job gets greater and greater. There is that tendency to want to pull back and narrow and focus, and that's not a bad thing. I think we should be looking at whether it is too broad or whether it is too narrow.
Mm-hmm. The health issues especially are the ones that seem to be so prominent in parents' minds. Obesity, smoking, addiction, those sorts of things are very important to parents, but they don't come across in the accountability agenda with the force that reading and writing do.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll be back in a moment.
For more than 40 years, the Faculty of Education at SFU has been delivering academic programs that are innovative and responsive. Based on the academic research of our professors and the expertise of practicing teachers from your communities, our programs are designed to meet classroom needs. As a community, we're piecing together a successful education experience for students today and in the future.
Don, the field of special education is what brought you into parent advocacy, I do believe, and so you're in a unique position to talk with us about the status of special education in the province now as you see it.
Yeah, I think there are, I have quite extensive provincial network, so I hear from hundreds of parents of kids with special needs and have for the last 10 years or so. There's certainly many success stories, I have to start out and say, and my son is definitely one of the success stories, and a very challenging student who is going to graduate with the full dogwood, knock wood, in 3 years or so. Yes, there are absolutely success stories and there's great stuff happening. But in terms of overall, what you hear mostly from parents, it is the status of special education in our schools is critical and it's deteriorating fast. And I think what concerns me most is that increasingly we're seeing families of kids with special needs forced to put their kids in private schools or to pay privately for tutoring, or else the alternative is to sit there and watch their kids getting left further and further behind, which is really heartbreaking in terms of the lost opportunity as well as the human tragedy on an individual case that causes. And just in Vancouver, for example, we've been starting to document, we started a few years ago documenting resources, and we have documented a 25% decrease in the number of special education teachers in Vancouver since 2001, despite a 35% increase in the number of students with special needs in the district. And the district is still spending about 30 million more on special education than the ministry is funding. And overall, in terms of provincial special education grants, in 2008, the provincial special education grants were totaled 340 million compared to 422 million in 2000. So there are some differences in how they're counting them, but you know, there's a lot. The actual special education grants are actually down. Spending is down in districts. And funding is not the only problem. One of the other big problems that we are trying to highlight is accountability. The ministry used to do an annual report called Students with Special Needs, How Are We Doing? And they haven't done that since 2005. there's been no report on how students with special needs are doing. Since 2002, they stopped tracking even school completion rates for students, for the low incidence students with special needs. So we've been trying to get the ministry to talk about their role, the need for leadership in addressing the problems in special education, and we haven't been able to get them to listen.
Well, that's a very difficult picture. And of course, I spent the bulk of my career in the United States, where special education advocacy really was very successful since the 70s. I've seen data that say that in real dollars, every new dollar that's been put into education since the 70s has gone into special ed in the United States. I have a feeling that's not the picture here, and in fact, you're saying we're moving backward.
Yeah. What we're seeing, and for example, some of the reasons for this are well-intentioned. For example, the class size and composition legislation, which was introduced a few years ago, may have been introduced with the best of intentions. But what it does is it says in a situation where resources are tight, you need to protect class sizes. So you need to protect those classroom teachers. So the ones who get cut are the special education teachers, the librarians, the ESL teachers, the Aboriginal support workers, the multicultural workers. So the inner city programs, so what you're seeing cut are the supports to the most vulnerable. And it's not just special education. I think all the supports for vulnerable students are being seriously eroded.
Well, you are leading us into a deep analysis of the school funding crisis, because that's, of course, at the source of this, and the debate has all been around the government saying we're putting more money in per capita, and the districts saying that it doesn't keep up with the demands, the mandates, and inflation. So what's your take on the school funding debate?
I've spent a lot of time researching this. I've read more documents and spent more time on the ministry databases and websites. I've discovered corners in there that I think even the ministry doesn't know about. And, you know, to put it simply, if funding is here, you increase funding here. But then the costs increase even more than funding, so that brings it down here. Enrollment goes down a bit, so you could say, well, that eases up your costs, so that goes up a bit there. But then you lose efficiencies when enrollment goes down, so you go back down. And then you add new demands and mandates to the school system. So the end, you get a net gap. It's not just as simple as saying funding has increased every year and enrollment is down. There's about 5 or 6 factors, and when you add them all in, you get a net gap. In the secretary-treasurers from the school boards, who are the chief accountants for school boards, actually sat down and analyzed what is the gap for the province between funding and just maintaining needs on a per-student basis, and it was 30 million for 2010 alone. And that's where we're seeing the big crisis all around the provinces. In Vancouver alone, the unfunded new costs for 2010 are 8.5 million. So when you're seeing the province and the district disagree on what's the extent of the deficit, but a deficit of between 11 and 17 million, at least 8.5 million of that is documented as unfunded new provincial costs. And then there are a number of other new provincial pressures that make that higher. So the other side to this is sort of the concern, well, education costs are out of control. You know, school boards are overspending, there's, you know, budget crises all around the province. And if you look at the actual data, as a percentage of the provincial budget, education was 26% of the provincial budget 20 years ago. It's now 15%. So in terms of overall spending, it's shrunk dramatically. If you look at it relative to GDP, which is what the total context of the province, it's gone down 14% since 2001. And if you look at StatScan data on the ground, what you're seeing are class sizes that are among the highest in Canada. And that's not counting the erosion of the non-enrolling services that we've been talking about.
And this, I'm hearing you say, hits special needs students, particularly at a time when the number of special needs students is growing proportional to the total school population. Do you have any idea why the proportion of special needs students is growing?
It's growing, particularly in Vancouver, but it's, if you exclude the gifted category, which has shrunk dramatically since the province stopped funding it. I've also looked at provincially, it's also growing overall, slightly, not as fast as Vancouver. There's any number of reasons for that. We know, for example, autism, which is, autism rates of diagnosis are going up. Learning disabilities, the rates, incidence is going up. And this is not in Vancouver, this is not just BC, these things are happening across North America. Nobody's really certain as to why. There are some arguments that maybe some overdiagnosis, they were diagnosing things that weren't diagnosed in the past. That may be some of it, but it doesn't explain the entire increase.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that helps people to understand why there is this conflict. I think you put it into specific terms. The other great conflict that's ongoing besides school funding is accountability. And I wondered if you would help us sort out the viewpoints of the main players, the ministry, the Fraser Institute, the BCTF, the media. How should an informed parent go about understanding the pros and cons of accountability as manifested in BC?
I'm a very strong believer in accountability and hard data. And I think if we are asking taxpayers to spend $6 billion annually on education, we need to be accountable. I think we need to be more accountable. But I think what we have now is we have a focus on flawed systems which are providing an illusion of accountability, which are creating a lot of busy work without providing real accountability. It's not answering the key questions. It's missing the big problems. It's not working. And I think when you think of accountability, when you talk about accountability, you have to break it down to two levels, because looking at how to demand accountability for my child as an individual for his outcomes demands very different tools than analyzing whether the public education system as a whole is meeting its performance standards. So I use very, very different approaches to assess how my child is doing and whether the system is serving my child as an individual to answering the question of how the system is doing.
Well, it makes me wonder how we got in the box. You've been quite critical there of the status quo, and we know there's many well-intentioned people who have gotten us to where we are. Do you have any idea why we've gotten so far off track, given that there are many people trying to do their jobs to the best of their capacities and so on?
Well, I think we're listening. One of the problems, and as a journalist I know this well, is one of the problems is the media and journalists have a really hard time translating very complex issues into stuff that's fun to read and that's going to attract their audiences. We get a lot of oversimplification of issues to the point where it really distorts what's going on. And I think, you know, the whole school listing, what do you call it?
Mm-hmm. The report card or Fraser Institute rankings. School
rankings and this sort of thing is one of those efforts to answer a very complex question in a very simple way that they think people will. So
that explains the media's difficulty.
So I think, as I have to admit, as a former journalist, I think we're a big part of the problem is that we have oversimplified the issues. We have led people to believe that there are simple ways to answer complex questions, as opposed to no. If you want to know if your child's school is doing well, you need to get out and go to the school and talk to the people there, talk to other parents, look up independent sources of information. You can't just go and look at a list and answer the question that simply.
There's also this fallacy of composition that enters in combination where my school is fine but schools in general aren't. You know, like my MLA is good, I'll vote for that person, but the legislature itself isn't good. Funny how people fall into that. I want to thank you for being with us. It's been a pleasure to interview you, and I hope that more parents get involved as you are in education. It would be good for all of us in BC.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll be back in a moment. Politicians and the media are prone to dismiss the voices of teachers and other professional educators as biased and self-interested. Perhaps they do so to keep their own monopoly of influence over public policy. It is much more difficult, however, for them to marginalize parents who speak out and the grassroots organizations of such citizens. Many observers assert that the 2005 BCTF strike was successful because parents threw their support behind striking teachers by a ratio of 2 to 1. Particularly concerned with their children's welfare and close to the schools, parents spoke out. Public schools thrive on democratic practice such as this, as well as open dialogue among stakeholder groups. For these reasons, the voices of parents are key to our school's success. It may be, however, that official parent organizations are not effective in joining the public debate. One has to wonder why this is. Meanwhile, outspoken individuals and the organizations they have spontaneously created have been carrying forward the parent's voice in British Columbian education. We welcome this point of view on Your Education Matters.